From the start, man's always tried to do better for himself, to take what he finds in nature and turn it to his own advantage. Once Captain Cook had revealed New Zealand to Europe, it wasn't long before that urge to better themselves brought Europeans here.
Men came to New Zealand very largely for what they could get their hands on and for what they could cart away. New Zealand was rich in the things that the world needed at that time, things that were becoming increasingly difficult to secure in the Northern Hemisphere. What the world needs today, though, is cheap energy, and that's something that New Zealand has in a variety of forms.
At Tiwai Point, near Bluff, on the coast of Southland, this aluminium smelter consumes a significant proportion of New Zealand's hydroelectricity. The smelter's raw material comes from Australia, and the end product goes to Japan. New Zealand's contribution is the energy.
Most of that energy is exported in the form of aluminium ingots. Some things never change.
There's certainly nothing new about Australians exploiting New Zealand. That started within 20 years of Captain Cook's first visit. In fact, the Australian connection was New Zealand's first and has proved the most persistent. Walk about almost anywhere in Sydney and you'll bump into a New Zealander.
I think we can start, Shirley. Shall we get the wig on?
Heather Begg's an international opera star. She performs at the New York Metropolitan, La Scala in Milan and Covent Garden, London.
Well, nearly ready to go, I think.
She's also a regular performer here at the Sydney Opera House, and this is perhaps her favourite setting.
I hope that chorus gentleman doesn't stand on my train
So
again
do
this
I,
time.
definitely.
That one's done. Here's the announcement. I'll have to
That's because Heather Begg is a New Zealander, and Sydney's her second home.
Bye-bye, Marge.
I'll tell him that unless he will consent to be more jocular,
Sing booed you, pooh-poohed you, and that's what you should say.
to cut his curly hair and stick an eyeglass in his ocular.
Sing booed you, ha-ha you, and that's what you should say.
Gilbert and Sullivan wrote their comic opera Patience in 1881,
Dine on chops and
but by
curly
then New Zealanders had frequently occupied centre stage in Sydney for almost a century.
Sing hey to you, good day to you, and that's what you should say.
Sing boo to you, poo-poo to you, and that's what I shall say.
Heather Begg's achievement has been outstanding, but each appearance she makes at Sydney's Opera House simply continues a tradition which began before European settlement in New Zealand was even considered.
And that's what I should say. Boo, boo, and that's what I should say. Bah, boo, bah, boo, and that's what I shall say.
The Sydney Opera House is hardly more than a schooner's length from the spot in Sydney Cove where the first New Zealand VIP to visit Australia stepped ashore. Like Heather Begg, he was a celebrity. His name was Te Pahi. He was a paramount chief of the Ngāpuhi tribe from Northland. Te Pahi came with his 5 sons in 1803 at the invitation of Philip Gidley King, Governor of New South Wales. They'd met 10 years earlier when King was Lieutenant Governor of the penal colony of Norfolk Island and had taken an unofficial trip to the Bay of Islands. King's next posting was to Government House, Parramatta, New South Wales, but he never lost his enthusiasm for New Zealand. The Ngāpuhi chief and his 5 sons were invited to be house guests at Governor King's official residence.
It must have been a most remarkable sight. 6 fiercely tattooed Maori warriors sitting down to dine with the governor and his family in this elegant dining room. Everybody who'd heard anything about New Zealand at that time looked upon the New Zealanders as savages and cannibals, much more accustomed to dining on Europeans rather than with them. But King was a man far in advance of his time, though not the only one. A very good friend of his, who frequently dined with him right here, shared the governor's interest in New Zealand and its people. He was a rotund Yorkshireman, Samuel Marsden, chaplain to the convict settlement and later missionary in New Zealand. And he bred cattle just down the road from here. Both men realized that the establishment of friendly links with the natives was essential if trade was to be developed with New Zealand.
Te Pahi and his sons became the first friendly link. In Sydney, they were an instant hit. From then on, Maori faces were a common sight in the streets. Governor King had begun a two-way connection that endures to this day. It's not difficult to imagine Te Pahi and his sons doing a haka beside the wharf in Sydney Cove. His descendants do their thing at a beachside disco in Bondi.
She belongs to another man. Watch out, watch out, 'cause you done the great foolish thing. Slow down, brother, spinning out again.
Their tribe's also Ngāpuhi. They call themselves the Milford Sounds.
Spinning out again. You're just a mother. The winning streak has landed. Slow down, brother. Spinning out again.
Nothing would have prevented the ultimate opening up of New Zealand, of course, but there's no doubt that King's interest in the country made it earlier, and his success in winning the trust of the Maoris made it easier. Thanks to him, then, the men who sailed from this little bay to New Zealand had a better idea of the people they'd meet there, even if they'd very little idea of the physical conditions they were to encounter.
Oh, well, here we are in Dusky Sound, discovered by Captain Cook and visited by him in 1773. Which time he spent about 5 weeks in here exploring the many bays and inlets. He charted the place very accurately.
Believe it or not, this remote corner of Fiordland in the southwest of the South Island was the scene of New Zealand's first European settlement. Today, nobody lives in Dusky Sound. It's visited only by fishing boats and tourist launches like the Waverley.
And here we are now in Luncheon Cove. Beautiful day here today, fairly typical of the Fiordland weather in fits and starts.
The fresh air and the scenery provide the attractions today. But the Pākehā who first lived here didn't brave the Tasman simply to enjoy the view. They'd come from Port Jackson to hunt the southern fur seal. They came in the convict ship Britannia under the command of Captain William Raven in 1792, and they stayed 10 months. Captain Raven deposited New Zealand's first sealing gang on Anchor Island. He left them with 12 months' provisions and, just in case he didn't return, enough equipment to build a boat.
Strange as it may seem, this is the scene of the first Pākehā settlement in New Zealand. And that first sealing gang from New South Wales built the first European-style house right here on what must have been the only piece of flat land in the whole of Dusky Sound. It's difficult today, of course, even to see the site itself because of all this vigorous regrowth. The house, though, wasn't very elaborate, but it was big. I imagine it's extended 11 or 12 meters in this direction, 5 or 6 meters wide in this other direction. Today, of course, there isn't a sign of it.
In fact, there isn't a sign of anything much at all in Dusky Sound to remind us of those European beginnings. And yet within a couple of years, there were more than 200 men marooned in different parts of Fiordland, more than all the other Pākehā in the rest of New Zealand put together. they led a cruel existence, surviving on seal meat, penguins, fish and fern root. It's no wonder that they got busy with the boat-building materials that Captain Raven had left them.
Here, you might say, the Pākehā shipbuilding industry in New Zealand started. It was born out of fear that the Britannia might not for some reason return to pick up the gang. In this case, though, the schooner did reappear as promised, though Captain Raven was disappointed at the gang's tally of seal skins, a mere 4,450. They were enough, though, to bring a succession of sealing vessels across the Tasman from Port Jackson and Hobart Town, and some of them returned home with as many as 70,000 skins.
Over the next 30 years, millions of skins were shipped to Sydney. The seal population of southern New Zealand was virtually exterminated. The seals weren't to come back for 150 years. Today they sun themselves unmolested on the rocks where that first sealing party set out their washing to dry. Nature has erased every trace of those first temporary settlers from across the Tasman.
But the next invasion was soon to come. It came only in part from Australia and also from much further afield. Men came in larger numbers and they hunted bigger game.
Wales offered richer rewards for the adventurers who sailed to New Zealand and for the merchants who backed them. Initially, the big whaling ships worked the Atlantic. They sailed from there, as well as from Port Jackson and Hobart Town, into the newly discovered whaling grounds in the South Pacific. The ships were the first floating factories, often staying at sea for years at a time. The last survivor of those whaling ships has been preserved and is very carefully looked after at Mystic, a seaport in Connecticut on the northeast coast of the United States. She sailed further and caught more whales than any other vessel of her kind. She also spent a lot of time in New Zealand waters and frequently put into the Bay of Islands. As well as building the ships, ports like Mystic became centres of trade and commerce as well as of handicrafts and industry. They also provided the stimulus, at least, that created New Zealand's first town. Kororareka, as it was known then, was a revictualling stop and a rest and recreation centre for a generation of whaling ships and their crews. During the 1830s, the Yankee whalers sailed into the Bay of Islands at the rate of more than one a week. Today, the Bay of Islands still lures seafarers from around the world. And just as in the whaling days, many of the foreigners are from the United States. The itinerant whalers sailed away, but their legacy lives on, and in more ways than one. For the whalers took their pleasures where they could, and they found the exotic beauty of the Maori women irresistible. So today, many Maori families in the Bay of Islands could lay claim to an American whaler somewhere in the family tree. But the Americans' effect on the whale population was more obvious. They hunted the sperm whale almost to extinction in the Southwest Pacific. Then came other men hunting a different whale, the right whale. This whale came close inshore to rear its young and was relatively easy to catch from shore-based stations. It could be processed cheaply on the beach without the need for an expensive floating factory. Once again, the New Zealand door was opened wide to Sydney-siders.
A chain of onshore stations soon dotted the east coast of the South Island mainly, from Fiordland to the Marlborough Sounds. And a dozen or more towns, large and small, owe their origins to the whalers who came on shore and put down roots on land.
Towns like Porirua, Kaikoura, Akaroa, Moraki, Bluff, Riverton and so on.
A few of the owners of whaling stations experienced brief prosperity, but none of them did quite so well as the man who owned half a dozen Otago and Southland whaling stations, including the one at Waikouaiti.
This began as one of 8 stations owned by a rough-fisted Sydney-sider called Johnny Jones. For 15 years, Johnny Jones dominated whaling and trading along the Murihiku coast. In 1838, he changed tack and shipped in settlers from Port Jackson. At Cornish Head, he started a farm. The produce from the farm fed both the settlers and the families on his whaling stations. The chances are that he was a convict's son. And yet, while theorists in London were still writing books about the principles of planned colonial settlement, Johnny Jones had already done it all. He built everything you'd find on an English country estate. Although many of his buildings still stand, Johnny Jones's land claims didn't last. He thought he'd bought from the Maoris 16,000 hectares. He ended up with a title to little more than 1,000 hectares. And Jones wouldn't have been able to build any kind of community if it hadn't been for his close association with one man.
The man that Jones and other whaling captains dealt with in acquiring Maori land was Tiwai, King of the Bluff, he was known. He was also known, though much more widely, as Bloody Jack, simply because of his long association with whalers and sealers out of Port Jackson and his persistent use of the Australian adjective.
Many of the land deeds of the period are decorated by Bloody Jack's distinctive moko. It was, of course, his signature. Bloody Jack was, in fact, the best example of the way some Maoris came to terms with the arrival of the Pākehā. In the north, though, there was a challenger with a different point of view, Te Rauparaha. And the two were bitter enemies. Te Rauparaha waged war and saw the Pākehā mainly as a means of getting his hands on one thing.
This is the sort of power Te Rauparaha acquired, and it gave him and his tribe the Ngāti Toa, a weapon against which tribes to the south of Ngāpuhi had no defence whatsoever. And for the Maori people throughout the country, it spelled disaster and destruction.
The Onawe Peninsula near Akaroa was once a thriving, heavily fortified pā. The pā, though, was virtually wiped out when Te Rauparaha brought his firepower south to settle a family feud.
This is where I am, and this is as far as Te Rauparaha penetrated southwards. He'd come from Ngāpuhi, which was the home territory of his tribe, the Ngāti Toa. He established headquarters at Kapiti, and from Kapiti he was able to invade the South Island at Kaikoura and Kaiapohia. And beyond this line remained the undisturbed domain of Bloody Jack.
If it hadn't been for Bloody Jack, Te Rauparaha would have swept even further south. Even so, the combination of the warrior chief from Ngāpuhi and the firearms of the Pākehā did enormous damage to the Maori people as a whole. It precipitated tribal warfare on a grand scale.
It not only decimated the Maori population almost everywhere, but it drove many tribes out of their traditional territories and set them on the move.
As well as guns, the Pākehā offered blankets, tobacco and liquor, irresistible temptations. In return, they demanded cargoes of timber, flax, potatoes. To supply these, the Maori had to give up a way of life they'd followed for centuries. They left their hilltop pā and their kumara gardens to work in swamps of flax and kahikatea, close to the Pākehā's ports of call. Their diet suffered. Disease was rampant. In the 50 years after 1820, the Maori population was halved. By 1900, it was down to 40,000, and everyone thought the Maori was doomed. But thanks largely to advances in medical science, that trend has been completely reversed. The Maori birth rate recovered dramatically until, by 1950, it was for a while as high as that of any cultural group anywhere.
Look at the light and let me have a look at your eyes. So good. Have a good look. That's a good boy.
Improving standards of community care have ensured that more and more of the children born survive. Back in the 1830s, the survival of the Maori was threatened most of all by their own intertribal warfare. What helped to save them then was concern for their welfare that came from a quite different quarter. After Samuel Marsden arrived in 1814, the churches the missionaries built took a while to catch on. The missionaries didn't speak Maori, and the Maoris spoke little English. Conversions at first were few. But the harmonies and songs of the Christian faith appealed to the Maori. and so did the storytelling. Slowly, the churches began to fill. The missionaries' first priority was to teach the Maori children to read and write. In 1837, the New Testament was finally published in Maori. That missionary tradition still survives. When the Bishop of Aotearoa holds a confirmation service at Ruatoria on the East Coast, two cultures come together in Christian worship.
Confirm, Almighty Father, your daughter whom we sign with the sign of the cross. Grant that she may daily grow in the grace of your Holy Spirit and continue your servant forever.
But the salvation of the Maori people last century came not from calls to worship, but from the missionaries' appeal to common sense. The missionaries were prepared to offer themselves as peacemakers between the warring tribes. Thanks to the church, there was a way for both sides to save face, and massive slaughter was avoided. The missionary's next self-appointed task was to preserve for the Maori his land.
The Church Missionary Society had the ear of the politicians here at Westminster, and for a time it appeared as if the society had persuaded the government not to allow the would-be colonizers to further disrupt Maori society by taking Maori land for organized settlement. So the Colonial Office informed the New Zealand Company that the government's first priority was to reach agreement with the Maoris on the question of sovereignty. The man who had to convey this decision to the New Zealand Company was Lord Normanby, who was appointed Secretary of State at the Colonial Office in 1839.
But in effect, all that Lord Normanby had done was to force the colonizers' hands, and they rushed to dispatch the Tory to New Zealand while the going was still good. Her voyage from Plymouth in 1839 was aimed quite simply at grabbing as much land as possible for the New Zealand Company before the British government could reach agreement with the Maoris.
It looked as if the colonizers had put one across the Colonial Office, and now Lord Normanby just had to act. But what was he to do? He probably pondered that question here at the Reform Club in Pall Mall. It was the sumptuous retreat of the Liberal members of the government of that time. What he did, in fact, was to issue a series of instructions to the man who'd already been appointed British consul in New Zealand, Captain William Hobson. And those instructions are far and away the best indication we have of what the man who so reluctantly accepted responsibility for New Zealand had in mind. Normanby's instructions contained three key elements. The first stressed the importance of reaching a genuine agreement with the Maoris. The second made it clear that only the Crown was to have the right to purchase land from the Maoris. But the third went further. Despite what he'd told the New Zealand Company only a few months before, Lord Normanby, after all, intended to make provision for organized settlement in New Zealand. He instructed Hobson, as he put it, to purchase such wasteland as may be progressively required for the occupation of settlers. So it's very clear that although the British government was concerned to see that the Maoris had a fair deal, it also, naturally enough, had the interests of British settlers very much in mind.
Captain Hobson arrived in New Zealand on the 29th of January 1840 and immediately began behaving as if his mission were already accomplished. Before he even met the local Maori chiefs in the Bay of Islands, he promoted himself from Captain Royal Navy to Lieutenant Governor, New Zealand, and issued a proclamation declaring New Zealand British territory.
The proclamation was an unfortunate start for New Zealand geography too, for it solemnly declared the islands of New Zealand to extend from 34 degrees 30 minutes north of the equator to latitude 47 degrees 10 minutes south. That means, of course, from about the latitude of Tokyo all the way to beyond Stewart Island, and would have made New Zealand as large as any of the mythical lost continents. The man who spotted that mistake, and just in time to save some red faces in high places, was the printer of the proclamation, William Colenso. Colenso was a remarkable character, though still only printer to the Church Missionary Society in the Bay of Islands. Colenso was the only Pākehā to stand up and voice his opinion in public here at the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi.
After the first Maori chief, Oneheke, put his mark on the treaty, Colenso stepped forward. In front of Captain Hobson and his naval officers, the government officials from New South Wales, in front of his own bosses, the senior missionaries, in front of all these people and the assembled Maori chiefs, the young printer asked if he could speak. Do the Maoris, he asked Captain Hobson, really understand the treaty that they're about to sign?
Colenso's was, in its polite and respectful way, I suppose, the first Waitangi Day protest, because Colenso expressed very firmly his personal conviction that the Maori chiefs just didn't understand the document to which they were about to attach their marks.
Some of today's Maori people have no difficulty in interpreting the treaty.
The treaty is the fraud! The treaty is the fraud! The treaty is the fraud!
Although the bitterness is focused on the signing at Waitangi, the real conflict runs deeper. It's a conflict between a society which valued land as a communal and spiritual resource, and one which in general values land as an individual and material possession.
Whether you leave peacefully and with dignity, or whether you are forcibly removed, is a decision for you to make.
The trouble started when the principles that William Hobson had embodied in the treaty were abandoned. Colonial politicians subsequently yielded to pressure from the settlers. The result was war and confiscation and a bitterness that endures to this day.
For being passive, this is what we get. How much longer must we talk, must we ask? How much bloody longer?
The Maori's effort to retain his land diverted development to the South Island. And there, buried in the alluvial gravel, was a magnet which proved far more attractive than anything the North Island then offered: gold. The riverbeds still yield a little of the precious metal, and at today's prices, it's worth digging deep to get it. The Canary Dredge operates today on the Taramacau River in Westland. It's the last of 20 steel monsters that have churned up the riverbeds and terraces of Westland and Otago. The first rush for South Island gold reached its peak in the 1860s. Then the prospectors had only their hands and a few simple tools. The landmarks left behind by mechanical monsters like the Canary Dredge are plain enough to see. The operators are now required to reclaim the desert of stones that the dredge leaves in its wake. In 20 years, pine trees will completely hide the tailings and their timber will become the basis of a new industry.
You look straight in front of us here now, you can see the large sluicing areas where the miners have been sluicing. They've actually just chopped straight through that section there with high pressure water. It's the old riverbed, it's where the river used to flow.
In central Otago, the landmarks left by the first gold miners are the focus of another modern industry, tourism.
They were all carried in by horse. Some of the machinery to get into the valley here took 6 months to shift the 20 miles from Queenstown to here.
Simply getting to where the gold was an ordeal in itself.
This is the Skipper's Road we're on here now. It started in 1862 and completed in about 1878. It was built with a lot of help from the miners, Chinese miners and European miners, to help them bring
Today's tourists get there by four-wheel drive. But the road's still rough enough to give you an inkling of the hardship the gold miners knew. Some tour operators call the Shotover Valley New Zealand's Grand Canyon. That's a bit over the edge, but the landscape is on a scale so vast that it makes mere human beings and their works seem puny. In the 1860s, 4,000 men camped on the banks of the Shotover River, sluicing and panning for gold.
Today, tourists do it for fun. Miners, though, did it for keeps. Of the thousands who swarmed over these hills and through these valleys, very, very few, the lucky ones only, made a fortune. And fewer still managed to hold on to the fortune that they made. Gold had a dramatic impact on the country. It brought people and it brought capital. Gold, though, was soon to run out. It was simply a matter of a flash in the pan.
Well, I've hunted Otago for gold, in the wind and the rain and the cold, and I've holed up all winter under the snow, all along the winding Molyneux, and that is where you need to have hope. I'm a waker, I will break up, and I'm never more going to roam. Well, I've panned in my dugout with never a nugget. I'm packing my things to go home.
But there were some people canny enough to prosper during the frenzied search for gold and careful enough to survive when it ran out. This is Otago's most exclusive establishment. It's the Dunedin Club, and it was established before gold was discovered in Otago. It was founded by squatters who ran sheep on the tussock grasslands in the interior of the province, and by a handful of business and professional men in the quiet, sober Presbyterian settlement of Dunedin. All the club's members then were amongst the earliest colonists in the south here and came to be known as Otago's old identity.
there was such a thing as an Otago establishment, then its headquarters were surely here.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning. Good morning.
Rather surprised.
Imagine the reaction when the gold miners arrived, along with the gamblers, speculators, publicans and shady ladies. The gentlemen were, in a word, appalled at what they like to call the new iniquity.
How many members these days are squatters?
But the members of the Dunedin Club really had the new iniquity to thank for the city's prosperity and influence. Dunedin was, after all, built on gold, and in the process it became New Zealand's first industrial city. The prosperity of the men who made it on gold is reflected in the grand style of their exclusive club. It's also reflected in the homes of some of the earliest members, which are even grander. Larnack Castle is the grandest of them all. It was built by William Larnack, who made his money as a banker to Dunedin, but spent the rest of his life in politics. Although he's best known for his castle, William Larnack has been underrated, I think, as a politician. No other politician was associated, sometimes as a cabinet colleague, with the three best-known prime ministers of the 19th century, Vogel, Grey and Seddon. For a man whose political achievements were liberal in spirit, the grand style of Larnack's castle seems, like the name he gave it, strangely out of character. Glass from Venice, oak from England, cobblestones from France and marble from Italy. Yet for all his wealth and achievement, Larnack's world collapsed during the long depression of the 1880s and the 1890s. In 1898, not here, but in the House of Representatives in Wellington, he shot himself. But his landmark remains.
This isn't nearly as grand as Larnack Castle's marble fireplaces, but it's comfier, it's homelier, and until the 1930s it was an almost universal landmark in New Zealand. Of all the products of the industries in Dunedin, spawned by the gold rushes, the Orion stove was far and away the most familiar. It was designed and built by Henry Shacklock.
Shacklock designed the Orion specifically for the pioneer homes that were being built throughout New Zealand. Without them, home life in both town and country would have been very miserable indeed.
And for 50 years, it was the hearth of New Zealand. On this cosy range, pioneer families boiled their water, baked their bread, cooked their food, and around it they warmed their toes, dried the babies' nappies, and aired their views on everything from the state of the weather to the fate of the nation.
Shacklock, the ironmaster, was a different breed of man from Larnack, but the success of both of them was due to the same thing, the commercial boom that followed the gold rush. And Shacklock bought land from Larnack on which to build his first factory. As it happens, he too committed suicide about 4 years after Larnack, but he'd left his mark too. The Shacklock coal range endured for many years. It even received near royal approval.
Gentlemen, having used one of your ranges, number 2, on the royal train between Auckland and Rotorua during the Duke of York's visit, I wish to add my unsolicited testimonial to its great superiority over any ranges I have ever used. Considering the small size of the range and the great number that had to be catered for, it greatly exceeded my most sanguine expectations. Arthur George Taylor, chef, Royal Train.
Shacklock's is one of the few industries spawned by gold in Dunedin that survives. Most others died or moved north. The new Shacklock factory at Tiwai, on the outskirts of Dunedin, turns out electrical appliances. But the grandsons of Henry Eli Shacklock are still involved in the family business. Unlike the ghost towns on the goldfields, Dunedin didn't close down when the gold rush came to an end. But today it has, in a sense, some of the characteristics of a ghost town. It hasn't changed much in the past 50 years, nor has its population grown to any extent. The landmarks of the past still dominate the urban landscape. Solid bluestone has not been dwarfed by high-rise steel and plastic. Dunedin's ascendancy waned too when gold ran out. By the 1890s, that first frantic era of ruthless exploitation had ended, not just in Otago and Southland, but throughout New Zealand.
But one thing all New Zealanders did learn in the first 100 years of Pākehā settlement after 1792 was that properly handled, the good earth lasts forever and promises a future and indeed a whole way of life, very much more substantial than seals or whales or gold.